I want to move on now to death. And there are two kinds of death that we want to define from the New Testament. One is spiritual and the other is physical. And it's important that we keep these things separate, because if you don't, you're going to not understand what the Bible says about death. There's just one, word used in the English language for death, but there are several words in Greek, or at least more than one, that means death. But you have to look at the context. These words are used interchangeably to apply to physical death or spiritual death. And however, the word death which applies to physical death is used less in the Bible. I've noticed that the writers, including Jesus himself, they tried to use other terms to describe physical death other than the word death. In fact, remember when Lazarus died, Jesus said he's sleeping. Well, he was physically dead at the time, and he used the word sleep, and Paul uses the same word, and there are other ways other terms that they use to talk about physical death. But sometimes when the Bible says death, it's talking about physical death as well. So let me take you back to Genesis 2, and you'll see where death began. Genesis 2:17, God is speaking to Adam, and he said not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And he said, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it you shall surely die. Now we know that Adam ate of the tree, and we know that he lived for hundreds of years after that. I mean, hundreds of years. So this word wasn't specifically applying to physical death, although it included it. In fact, in this case, the word die literally means spiritually and physically. And if you look in the margin, in most Bibles, if you look in the margin where it says you'll surely die, it says in dying you will die. And man, that's a great way to describe what happened in the Garden of Eden when Adam sinned. God warned him that if you eat of the fruit of this tree, in dying you'll die. So it alludes to two deaths. One was spiritual, which happened immediately, and then physical death followed a few hundred years later. But he did die. In dying, he died. He died on the day he ate, and then he died physically again. He died physically years later. So death became part of the human experience at the fall of man in the Garden of Eden. Spiritual death came immediately, and then physical death followed spiritual death. Death is an enemy, and it is now a permanent part of the human experience, at least in this world. It was never the will of God. God didn't intend it. He didn't plan it. In fact, He warned us against it. And it was man that did this. Adam made the choice. He knew the stakes. He knew what God's will was. And now, because of his transgression, we have to deal with death in life. And one of the most painful experiences you could ever have is to have a loved one die physically. That was never supposed to happen. Separation of the human spirit from the body was not supposed to happen. God created us to live forever. He created mankind to be holy and in fellowship and communion with Him. We were never supposed to be kicked out of the garden. We were never supposed to get sick. We were never supposed to experience sin and guilt and shame and murder and famine and pestilence and disease. We were never supposed to go through those experiences. And if we had listened to God, we would not have. And I say all this to say this: death was not God's plan. So as we go through the process of death, losing loved ones and seeing people in this world suffering, you go, why would a loving God allow these things to happen? Well, He tried to stop it. He gave man a free will, and mankind, the human race, jumped into sin and are dealing with the consequences of that. But God had nothing to do with it, and I think this is important. In fact, he had everything to do with delivering us from death. And it cost God a great deal for us to sin and for the world to go through the process of being separated from God, because He came and paid the price. He came and took the penalty upon Himself. He experienced death Himself. Hebrews 2:14 and 15. Inasmuch then as children have partaken of flesh and blood, in other words, just like you were born in a physical body, He Himself likewise shared in the same, that through death He might destroy him that had the power of death, that is the devil, and release those who through fear of death were all their lifetime subject to bondage. So I'm taking a little bit of time to tell you this, because when you stand by the deathbed of a loved one and they pass on into eternity, if you're in some way blaming God for that experience, then it's going to be difficult to recover. It's going to be difficult to get over. And there have been people that have been handicapped spiritually because they're blaming God for the death of a loved one. And I just want to say, sometimes we get so close we can't see the truth, and we can't see the forest for the trees. And so I don't care what circumstances led up to that loved one being on that deathbed, but I can tell you this, it was never God's intention for you to be separated from your loved ones through physical death. That was not God's plan. So to blame God for these things is really misplaced blame, and it has a negative effect spiritually on Christians. There are Christians that are bitter and have walked away from God because they don't understand certain things that have happened. And I just want to make it clear, death was not God's idea. God tried to keep us, it's just like human beings, to not listen to God and do what He said not to do and then blame Him when we get in trouble. He is not to blame. There are a lot of mysteries in this world, and there are a lot of experiences that I can't explain. I've got questions myself. I don't know the answer to every situation. I don't know the why for everything that's happened in my life and other people's lives, but I do know this. God never intended us to die. He never intended for death to be part of the human experience. And that is so important for us we need to live in the light of that and in the reality of that. Now, Jesus came and He's offered redemption. He paid the price. He's delivered us from the fear of death, and all these things are true, and we can tap in to that. And some of us do a better job of tapping into it than others. In other words, receiving what He did and enjoying our rights and privileges. But in the long run, in the big picture, death was not God's plan. So He should never be blamed for death. He shouldn't get the blame for death. It's hard to be healed. It's hard to have God heal your heart when you blame Him for your wounds. And so that's the position people get in, and the enemy takes advantage of that. And so I just wanted to set the record straight today. Death is part of life, physical death, but it wasn't God's plan. It wasn't God's. I watched my dad pass from this life to that one, and not once did I ever blame God. I wanted to see things differently. I wanted to see a miracle. I wanted to see his life extended. We weren't able to make that happen, but never once did I blame God for that experience. And I tell you, that helps you go through these dark moments of life much more than if there's this suspicion or this doubt in your mind that why did God do this, or why did God let this happen? If God was going to stop people from having bad experiences, if He was going to stop people from experiencing evil, then He would have handcuffed Adam in the Garden of Eden. He would have put him in a cell and said, you're not supposed to eat of the tree, and you're never going to have a chance because I won't let you. God chose not to interact with us that way. He chose to give us freedom, and that freedom has consequences. So it's not fair for us to make wrong choices because of the freedom God gave us. We're supposed to use our freedom to choose Him.
Visit gregfritz.org to download the MP3s for free by entering code FREE at checkout.